Hey everybody, here looking at one of my refurbished computers, and I decided to try something new today. This is a socket AM2 platform. Motherboard is a BioStar NF615 Micro AM2 SE. This motherboard I got out of a part system years ago. I found it in an E-Machines computer, and anyways, I got it installed in this system here, and the hard drive is one of those white label 160 gig Western Digital Caviar Blue drives. This one has a card reader on the front and DV-ROM and C burner. You know, kind of a basic end refurbished computer for browsing the web and that kind of stuff. And basically, when I went to build this thing, I initially had slapped in a AMD X2 3800 plus Windsor, obviously dual core, and this motherboard didn't seem to recognize it. I'm sure with the BIOS update it probably would, but you know, at the time all I had was the 3800 plus X2 or AMD Sempron 3400 plus chips, and I have a crap load of them because over the years I have swapped them out for Athlon 64 chips in services and, you know, refurbished computers and, you know, all that stuff. So I had no choice but to use the Sempron, and obviously, you know, I was disappointed with the performance because, you know, Semprons stock don't perform very well at all. So I decided to do a little overclocking here and see how much of a difference I can make out of this thing. This is a Sempron 3400 plus AM2 Manila codename chip, 90 nanometer. Normally runs at 1.8 gig, only 256K of L2 cache. For a comparison, the AM2 single cores usually had 512 megabytes of L2. And let's say like a 3400 plus AM2 would be clocked at probably 2.2 gigahertz, or in some cases maybe 2 gigahertz. So what I did is I did some looking online, and I found out that this is a highly overclockable CPU. And you're thinking, I mean, you're looking at this thing, you're thinking, how the heck can you overclock a thing like this with such a, you know, basic end cooler and stuff like that? Well, it's possible. And with a very good cooler, people have actually gotten this thing up to like 2.8 gig, like a 1 gigahertz overclock. But anyways, let's go and have a look here. This is an E-Machines case. Power supply is a Delta 300 watt pulled from a E-Machines. And of course, I done told you about the motherboard. We have 2 gigs of DDR2 memory. Again, there's the hard disk drive, which is white label. I've been running Prime 95 on this thing for, let's see, I guess 14 or 15 minutes now. It runs like a champ. No stability problems at all. I mean, it's been running wide up 100%, and it's running pretty warm too, obviously. The core temp is in the upper 50s Celsius, and that heatsink there is burning hot to the touch. Yeah, that heatsink there was intended for a stock Sempron, and it does have smart fan turned on, so the fan's not maxed out. However, smart fan is adjusting properly and turning up the fan speed to keep this thing below, you know, the maximum threshold of the CPU, what it's designed for. But basically, the stock voltage on this chip is like 1.25. I now have the voltage at like 1.32. Got it at 2.25 gig, 450 megahertz overclock. I had the I set the hypertransport link down to 3 times. It may actually work at 4. I may have to try that, because 250 times 4 is 1,000. So I'm curious to see if the hypertransport link on this chip will be able to perform at, you know, what a typical Athlon 64 would do. I may try that next. But Yeah, it's running at 2.25 gig. I'm going to exit this Prime 95, and I'm going to try the 1000 megahertz HT link. And I must say, this thing, after doing that first overclock, it just, I mean, it's like a whole different machine. It's like a, almost, I mean, in regards to, you know, startup and shutdown performance, it's about the same as what my Athlon 64 systems do in my refurbished computers. And of course, this white label hard drive performs very well, and that helps a lot too. So I'm going to set this to 4 times. It can go up to 5, but we need it only at 4. We're going to see if this thing can run stable at a 1000 megahertz, you know, 1 gigahertz hyper transport bus. And look, this motherboard even allows you to overclock the onboard graphics, which is the GeForce 6150 LE. And I will be changing out that heatsink for a better one before I sell this system. The CPU runs about 7 degrees Celsius hotter now than it did stock. To be honest, I'm not gonna try to push it any further than 250 on the main bus. And of course I had to turn down the memory speed. I see later on I could probably tweak the memory some. But this thing is, after doing this simple overclock here, this thing is starting up faster, shutting down faster, and it seems more responsive than it was before. Of course, Windows Vista, as we all know, is not known for fast startups. But I have to install what I have keys for. Wish I had tons of Windows 7 keys to use, but I don't. Now let's go ahead and redo the Prime 95 test. First I'm going to pull up, you know, some other things like Task Manager, you know, all that great stuff. And of course, when you increase that hyper transport bus, you will definitely improve performance on your AMD processor. So let's go ahead and pull up CPU-Z. So now our hyper transport link is about 1000 megahertz. So really the only difference we're seeing now between, you know, a stock AMD single core AM2 3400 plus is the L2 cache is only half the amount. Everything else now is practically the same, except for the higher bus speed, 250 megahertz. So now let's go ahead and rerun that test. Pull up this. You know, to be honest, the reason why I haven't changed out the heatsink is I want to see if this thing can run stable with that crappy cooler on here. If it runs stable with a crappy cooler, I know it will run stable with a better cooler. Which I'm going to swap it out for this cooler here after I clean it out, which is a bit better than that one. Now let's go ahead and run Prime. I'm running Prime 95 under, you know, default options, the blend option. Should be plenty enough for testing this thing. Now let's see if it crashes or not. Now using 100% of the processor. And I think, I believe this thing is going to work out. Because, for those who don't know, in regards to budget processors like this, you know, the way you get budget processors is, what they do is, you know, AMD manufactures X amount of cores for the Athlon 64 single core. And, of course, you know, some may have defects. Sometimes maybe not all the cache works. You know, or other things. So what they do is, if you get a core that has some defective L2 cache, they just simply market it as a Sempron and cut the cache in half to 256K and sell it, you know, as a Sempron, and they turn the HT link down to 800 megahertz, and you know, let's sell it as that. Another fine example of this would be, well, let's say a Sempron 3200 plus Manila. Probably the same, you know, I believe it's the same exact core, but I think those have even more defective L2 cache, because the Sempron 3200 plus only has 128K of L2 versus the 256K that the 3400 plus has. And another good example of AMD using this practice, which Intel does the same thing pretty much, is with the Phenom 2 processors. You have your Phenom 2 X6, which is a different architecture, but you have your X4, your X3, and your X2 chips, all based off the DNAB core. And let's say you have a defective core out of all four of those cores. What they'll do is they'll disable that fourth core and market it as a Phenom 2 X3. Or if they have two defective cores, disable a second one, make it a Phenom 2 X2. Or if they have some defective level 3 cache, disable the level 3 cache altogether and sell the chip as an Athlon 2. And I mean, those, and not every Athlon 2 or every Phenom 2 you get has defective stuff on it that was disabled, because you got to think about it. This is a common practice, but these companies have to also supply particular demands. So sometimes they'll take a perfectly functioning Phenom 2 quad and disable a core 2 and sell it as a Phenom 2 X3 or Phenom 2 X2. That's where the utilities and some motherboard BIOSes that enable you to re-enable those cores come in handy. Because sometimes, I mean, you can take a gamble and purchase a cheaper end processor like that and just re-enable the cores and actually get, you know, make an X4 out of an X2. Anyways, now you kind of understand how that works. This system here is still running just fine. Well, of course, it's only on test 1, but I can see it working just fine under the current conditions. CPU is about 60 degrees Celsius. And yes, that heatsink there, I imagine it's very hot to the touch. Definitely is. Very hot to the touch. Our NOR bridge is at 57 degrees Celsius. The heatsink, at least this guy is saying 44 degrees C. Or 44.6 max. Now, I'm not 100% sure about the accuracy of this thing, but anyways, I think this turned out pretty good. So, we officially unleashed some performance to this computer here by overclocking that Sempron from 1.8 gigahertz to 2.25, and bringing the hypertransport bus up from 800 megahertz to 1000 megahertz. Runs perfectly fine. So anyways, before I wrap up this video, let's go and show you a restart. And I actually do have a video of how this thing performed prior to this, and I'll put a link in the description. That video is the update on the Western Digital white label hard drives. So let's go ahead and restart this thing. I'm going to close out everything here. So basically, you can watch that video I mentioned about. You can see how much slower this thing is at startup, and you can compare it to what it is now. And after I restart, I think Yeah, after I do a restart, I will do a refresh of the Windows Experience Index. Yes, this thing is definitely good to go. You know, it's my first time ever overclocking a Sempron. And I must say, I'm impressed with this one. So, in your worst case scenarios, let's say you have some old crappy Semprons laying around. You done sold all your Athlon 64s, but you do have some good motherboards with overclocking features available. You could easily take, a Sempron with even a basic cooler and get maybe 300 to 400 megahertz out of it without much of any problem. Now, if you notice, the Windows Vista loading bar is not stopping much. When it freezes like that, it means the CPU is pretty much maxed out. Now, amazingly, the Windows 7 animation doesn't do this kind of thing. And of course, with Vista, it's taking a while to start. It's like every time you restart it, it's slower, or sometimes you restart it, it's faster. But I can definitely tell you, just from usability of this thing, it is definitely a night and day difference. Now, let's go ahead and look at the Windows Experience Index. And what I'll do is I'll take a screenshot of the existing one. You can use snipping tool to do that. What I'll do is this here. This is prior to the overclock. Pay close attention to the processor and RAM numbers. These are the ones that you'll probably see the biggest change in. Which, look at the score for the hard disk. It's 5.9. That's not bad for this hard drive that I only paid like $18 for. New. Now we're going to refresh now. You can get this opportunity to run. Now I did overclock like this a while back on a CPU that was, had a lock multiplier. It was in the Mid-Tower Lux Black Max. Back when it had the AMD Socket 939 dual core 3800 plus CPU. I overclocked that system from 2 GHz to 2.5 GHz, and it made a huge difference in overall performance and in the Windows Experience Index scores. The biggest I've ever seen from an overclock. Now obviously in Windows Vista, the Windows Experience Index works a little bit different, and you're limited, the number only goes up to 5.9. In Windows 7 it goes up to 7.9, and I believe in Windows 8 it goes up to 9.9. Now in Windows 8.1, Windows Experience Index is no longer there. We're just letting this run. Here we go, assessing CPU performance. This is what I'm curious to see see if we get a difference. Now I doubt we'll see a big difference, if any at all, in the graphics, because obviously we haven't done anything to the graphics. But in some cases, increasing that hypertransfer bus might make a little bit of a difference. Let's check in the memory performance now. Now it's assessing disk performance. That should remain relatively the same. It's complete. Let's see if we have a difference. We do. In both the, look here. Let's do the side-by-side comparison. We got an increase in the processor, the RAM, and the graphics scores. Nice. On the left is prior to the overclock, and on the right is after. There's your left, and of course on the right you can see the difference. The base score hasn't changed because the gaming graphics score did not change. But the CPU went from a 3.8 to a 4.2. The memory went from a 4.8 to a 5.2. The desktop performance graphics went from a 3.0 to a 3.2. And everything else remained the same. I'm highly impressed with this overclock here. So, as I mentioned, if you have a bunch of old Semprons laying around that are stock at AM2 and you have a nice motherboard, a couple of nice motherboards you don't care to keep, or if you do care to keep, if you're using it for yourself, just keep in mind that you can overclock that Sempron and really unlock its performance potential. So anyways, any questions or comments, feel free to ask, and thanks for watching.